Good afternoon. I can say that finally. I'm in the East Coast, and you are with us at Broadband Breakfast for another weekly edition of Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, June 17th, 2020. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher, and we have three exceptional guests to talk about our discussion today about federal funds and how they can affect your return on investment for broadband projects. As a reminder, each of the Wednesdays this month, we're focusing on one topic that we'll be tackling at the Digital Infrastructure Investment mini conference that we'll be holding on August 10th. This will be a physical virtual event. So at Broadband Community Summit in Houston, we'll be live, but we'll also be online so that everyone who has signed up to register to attend the conference, and you do need to register, will be able to participate. And the topics we'll be discussing at Digital Infrastructure Investment include last mile access, how the new models are emerging to enable deployment at the last mile. We'll also be talking about financing and the experience of infrastructure investment funds. We'll be talking about federal funds and different pools of funding, whether through the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund or through opportunity zones or through Economic Development Agency or other agencies and opportunities. And of course, we'll also be talking about the neutral host infrastructure and how that is emerging, if you will, as a model for the rest of the non-wireless world, and how we're beginning to see a lot of wholesale access proposals in getting advanced digital infrastructure throughout the country. So once again, I'm really pleased to welcome three great guests that will be talking with us today. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to them. We have with us, kind of clockwise here, at least in my view, we have Carol Maddie. Carol is the principal at Maddie Consulting LLC, and she has many years of experience working in the U.S. government, including most recently as the Deputy Chief of the Wireline Competition Bureau at the FCC. And she'll be able to talk specifically to some of the background lead up to the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. Following Carol, we'll hear first from Blair. Blair Levin kind of needs no introduction. He's kind of the wise man of the broadband world. He led the national broadband plan of the FCC in 2010, 2011, and has continued to talk and speak and think and connect people in this space, most recently as a non-resident senior fellow with Brookings and through other affiliations that he can also speak to. And then finally, we'll be hearing from Graham Richard. Graham was the former mayor of Fort Wayne, Indiana. I've worked closely with Graham over the years. Very, very grateful that he's agreed to be with us in this group. And he's had a lot of experience in the advanced energy sector. And so he can speak about projects, deployments, and particularly the role that opportunity zones and other projects can have in facilitating. So we want to make this a broad discussion. Some of the advantages of being able to speak to this subject now versus August 10th is that August 10th will be too late to participate in the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, but it's not too late now. This, I hasten to add, is not going to be a detailed, in-depth conversation. Carol Maddie and myself and many others have been involved in RDOF webinars all over the place. And so you won't necessarily get that here, but you will be able to get some of the background lead up and some thoughts that Carol has. So let's go ahead and turn it over to you, Carol, to tell us a little bit about the lead up to RDOF and what the opportunity represents.
Sure, and thanks for that introduction. The RDOF literally is the culmination of work that started more than a decade ago. I worked with Blair on the National Broadband Plan, and that plan laid out a vision for reforming the FCC's old, antiquated universal service program that historically supported voice service, and going through a multi-step transition to reorient the program towards supporting broadband. The FCC subsequently took a series of steps. It created what was known as the Connect America Fund, and the purpose of that, honestly, was it was a transitional path to a long-term vision of awarding funding on a competitive basis, not just to the incumbent telephone companies, but to open up this FCC Universal Service Program to any providers that are willing to serve the areas and meet the FCC's performance requirements. So the FCC initially implemented the Connect America Fund in 2015, providing funding for a limited period of time to the largest telcos in the nation to deploy a limited amount of broadband to discrete areas of the country. But the vision always was that at the end of that term, and that term is ending in 2020, that the FCC then going forward would award funding on a competitive basis. So the RDOF, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, is that the fruition and the culmination of literally a decade of work getting to this point. It will make funding available to areas of the country that are deemed to be, quote, high cost. The money is not available in cities, isn't available in the center of town. The intention of this program is to get funding out to the areas outside of town where the economics and the business case just does not work, to provide supplemental governmental funding. The application process starts just in 2 weeks from now. July 1st is when the FCC will start to accept applications, and the application deadline is July 15th. What folks will be doing is actually providing basic information to the FCC to be allowed to bid in this auction. The funding is awarded competitively. Companies all over the nation are going to be competing against each other to receive funding. The budget for the overall program, this first auction, phase 1 auction, is $1.6 billion annually over a 10-year term, which equates to $16 billion. So to date, this will be the largest single funding program that the FCC has ever launched towards providing broadband, and it will be open to entities that are willing to provide service in one of a series of performance tiers, with the minimum being 25.3 on all the way up to service providers that are interested in providing gigabit service. So it's a very exciting opportunity, and anybody that is serving these areas or is adjacent to these areas that wants to build out their network, enlarge their footprint, and bring service to the portions of rural America that don't have service today, they should be taking a hard look at this program. And with that, I'll stop.
Carol, I was muted for a moment, had to get off mute. Can I just ask you to take another moment or two to go back to this transition from the old model to the new model that was embodied in CAF 2 and RDOF 1? And could you speak particularly about the cost model, the CAM, I guess, is the buzzword. And what is that all about? What are these reserve prices that people are asking questions about everywhere? Like, just walk us through what it's like to transition from an old style USF program to a new competitive market where there will be bidding and reverse auctions and so forth.
Sure. Well, as part of this program, the model that the FCC uses actually has its genesis in the National Broadband Plan. In the Broadband Plan, the staff, developed an estimate of what the cost would be to extend fiber to the premise all over the country. And then there were various estimates about, well, what if we extended fiber to everywhere but the last 1%? How would that change the cost and so forth? The model was then refined after the National Broadband Plan over a series of years, basically from 2012 to 2015, and that was the work that I oversaw. And the model was used, and it is an engineering model estimating the cost of extending fiber under the assumption that there are no facilities in place, no assets in place. So that model created a figure that was offered to the large telcos, we called it the right of first refusal. And they could accept that money, as I said, for this 5-year, 6-year period ending in 2020, or they could turn it down. But that cost model, basically, as I said, it's an estimate of the cost of deploying fiber. And that model now is being used in the RDOF to create what's known as the reserve price, which is basically the maximum amount of funding that will be available for any geographic area. Now, the beauty of a competitive process, of course, is different providers may be able to serve an area at a lower cost because they already have assets in place or assets that they can leverage. And I'll use an example. One of the segments of the industry that's become very interested in the RDOF are electric cooperatives. Electric cooperatives already may have fiber distribution plant for smart grid purposes. They've already got the poles. They've got assets in place. So they may be able to actually serve the area cheaper than the quote reserve price because they've got existing assets that they can use towards this purpose. But as I said, so that's what the model is. That's where these numbers come from. But the point is competition is going to bid the price down, and the auctions force interested parties to reveal their price. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I particularly appreciate your mentioning the reserve price, where that comes from, and how that may or may not bear a relationship to the cost that the provider is going to have. But from the FCC's point of view, that doesn't matter. They're trying to get the cheapest build out at the fastest technologies, and that's what accounts for the different weights based on
and
lower
it's all
speed.
very complicated. I'm not sure we have time to get into all of the complicated weeds.
We certainly don't, but it's just worth bearing in mind the big picture, right? And why we are where we are. And so there's no one better to tell us kind of why we are where we are and what happens next than Blair. So let me go ahead and unmute your mic, Blair, and turn it over to you to give us your perspective, not just on this piece of it, but on the broader piece, even including the way potential future stimulus packages may be incorporated into broadband rollouts. What are your thoughts on some of these issues, Blair?
So I'm going to start in ancient history, which is to say early in March, at a time when we were about to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the National Broadband Plan. And let me just add, it's a real pleasure to be with Drew, who we talked a lot during that period, and Graham, who also gave us a lot because of his experience as the mayor of Fort Wayne, but also Carol, who really did a great deal of the writing, the thinking, and stayed to implement it. And I think we've made a lot of progress. But I'm going to start in March of this year. We were prepared to celebrate the 10th anniversary, and instead, like all events, it got canceled because of COVID. And the reason I mention that is I think COVID did a couple of things beyond the many terrible things it did to the economy and to people and to public health. But for purposes of this discussion, it created a wide sense and a deep sense that we really need to finish the job of getting broadband networks everywhere and getting everyone on them, and doing a better job of delivering public services like education and healthcare, public safety, job opportunity over that platform. In a world that some have described as remote everything, that is empowered by broadband. And so there is now a political consensus that we need to finish the job that the National Broadband Plan set out to do 10 years ago. At that time, by the way, there wasn't a political consensus. It wasn't on the top of anybody's priority. We were in the middle of a recession, and so one can understand how people were focused on other things. But now there really is a really interesting political consensus about the kind of issues Carol was talking about. And the reason I mention that is I could point to RDOF, I could point to the Department of Commerce having economic development money available for certain kinds of broadband deployments. We could talk about the Department of Agriculture, which also has them, though curiously, their minimum bandwidth requirements are much lower than the 25.3 that the FCC does. So there's a bunch of different government programs. There's also in the tax code opportunity zones, and some people, and I'm actually a participant in one of them, are trying to use opportunity zones to build out broadband where it currently is either inadequate or doesn't exist. So there's lots of different government programs, but I do not underestimate how the politics of this issue has changed. And I would note that the press is reporting this morning that the Trump administration is close to sending Congress a new infrastructure package. We can all recall the infrastructure package it sent several years ago, which led to a number of efforts jokingly referred to as Infrastructure Week, because the administration really wanted to focus on infrastructure and found itself being diverted into the latest tweet storm, which I bet happens again this time too. But my point is, I do think momentum is building toward a more significant government, the federal government intervention, because the marketplace won't solve the problem. And I think everybody kind of understands that now. And let me just close this part, though happy to answer any questions, by saying that the Democrats on the House side have proposed $80 billion for solving the broadband deployment problem. One can argue about whether that is needed. That number comes from a memo that was written in the final days of the Wheeler FCC, and I says my reading of the numbers since then suggests that that number could be lower. But I think that kind of commitment, if we think about the broader question of what do we need to do to get networks everywhere, get everybody on it, and make sure state and local governments have the infrastructure they need to improve how they deliver services, which can be anything from remote education to unemployment benefits. And I think we might all recall that very painful picture of people in Florida lining up in the early days of COVID at the risk of their own lives to fill out a piece of paper to qualify for unemployment benefits. That's not a scene we should ever want to see repeated.
Right.
So there's a lot to be done, but I think the desire of the federal government to do that is going to be increasing.
Let me ask you, Blair, thank you for that point about, tying it always. And this is one of the marvelous things of the National Broadband Plan. It had this section on national purposes, right? And the way broadband goes to health and education and civic connectedness and all those things we think of as applications and use. But I want to go back to 2010 or 2009. I remember hearing you make this point crystal clear. It stuck with me since then. The difference between CapEx and OpEx, okay? And so you were making the point, if I recall, that the stimulus, the measly 7.2 billion devoted to broadband in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which you're now saying could be matched by an 80 billion or somewhere in that neighborhood amount that we're talking about now, that you were arguing should be seen as the CapEx, and the Universal Service Fund, I don't know whether by default, has been seen as OpEx. Could you just give your take on USF? Now, of course, we're talking about the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. Should we be thinking of that as the OpEx, the operating expenses, or as the CapEx, the capital expenses for building out advanced broadband networks?
Well, actually, Carol and I wrote a piece together for Brookings arguing that if the federal government were to give the FCC a one-time capital infusion, it would be great to do an all CapEx budget, reverse auction, in which the parties would bid on the amount as Carol described in this reverse auction, but they would essentially say, if you give us this money, we will never come back to you again to ask for more money. Part of the irrationality of the current system is we are funding what is primarily a capital expenditure problem. That is to say, the CapEx of putting the fiber into the ground or building towers or however you want to build out the network, with fundamentally an operating expense revenue stream, which is to say contributions made by consumers every month on their bill. They pay a certain amount, which goes into the Universal Service Fund. So there's a disconnect there. And there's also what my conservative friends also often speak about as a kind of the moral hazard of these kind of government programs, where you have a bunch of people who are used to getting money, and they build their business model around assuring that they get that money every month and every year and continuing. And you want to move people off the system so that the market is making as many of the determinations about how they spend their money as possible. And what happens, and this is, I'm not accusing anyone of immorality or illegality, I'm just saying what happens is that people devote a lot more time and attention to buying lobbyists than improving their networks, because that's what the system does. I think it was an enormous accomplishment of the FCC over the last 10 years to make that transition from supporting voice to supporting broadband. I think it was an enormous accomplishment to move from cost models to reverse auctions. So I don't want to be seen as being critical of that achievement, but I think where we are now, it would be a great thing to essentially move as many of the carriers in rural America off of the continuing support mechanism and move them once and for all onto more market mechanisms. And that can be done with the kind of CapEx budget that Carol and I described.
Excellent, excellent. So many more questions, including speeds and symmetrical networks and so forth. But let's get another voice into this picture. Graham, why don't you start just a little bit back from broadband and the role that you played in Fort Wayne, but then talk us through some of the other work you've been involved in advanced energy and why you're bullish on opportunity zones and how they can play a role in this broadband deployment scenario. And I'll unmute you, Graham, so you can have the mic.
Thanks, Drew. It's a great pleasure to be here. Blair, we work closely together, and Carol, I look forward to learning more about your work. Sometimes I do a kind of an online learning support for my grandkids. So I'm used to putting things, Drew, in kind of simplified form. So I've got this little, my dream is that in the next decade, we combine public and private resources to bring gig broadband and clean energy, the clean economy for all. And if we do that, we're going to be creating 10 million jobs by 2030. That's kind of an estimate, but I believe it to be an accurate one. So as a former mayor and as a business owner and the founding CEO of the Advanced Energy Economy of Business Trade Association, promoting the policies, particularly at the state level, to encourage secure, clean, affordable energy, there's this marvelous intersection. And I think, Blair, you and I have talked about this over the years, for us to have the advanced energy and the advanced broadband as local systems solutions rather than thinking of them in silos. Because in the end, if you're a city like we were in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where we worked hard to get advanced broadband, in the end, you need that for the delivery of what is so salient, what is now so evident. I think Mike Render has done some recent research on this, which is during COVID, particularly the earlier period of COVID, what did we learn about the utilization of broadband? Well, what we learned is that it was a lifeline for all kinds of important services. And that obviously two-way, high capability for interaction, whether that's video conferencing, telehealth, just the extensive amount of learning and connection and social networking, all of that dramatized how critical broadband as an essential service, like a mayor would look at water and sewer and streets and other infrastructure. We now have this incredible prosperity opportunity. And the 2 points I'd make quickly, and then we can talk about this later, is this will require a new type of partnership, particularly between those at the local level, rural communities, mid-sized cities, large cities. We're all going to have to understand how to get projects going in our community that will involve both high quality, advanced broadband and what I would call the clean economy, meaning the use of wind and solar, and we can give example of microgrids, all of the new innovative approaches for locally produced distributed energy require a two-way connection in a grid that was not designed to do that 100 years ago. And so the intersection of the capacity building of high-speed, fiber optic, preferably broadband, with the local grids for resilience, some call them smart blocks, some smart microgrids, smart nanogrids. You want that to be an asset, particularly as we see more outages. And so the technology, the cost for solar, the combination of batteries, storage, and digital technology is creating a massive revolution in the transition to locally produced energy. We can talk about what the rural electric cooperatives are doing in that regard, but in almost every sector, in every community, there's a discussion about what is the future of electricity and how do you take advantages, like Blair mentioned, of the 8,700 opportunity zones where there's significant private sector tax advantages, and get out of the silos that we're in and start talking about the solutions that people want in their community, where you could leverage private dollars with public assets, with tax advantages. And already in the 2 trillion COVID dollars, there are dollars that can be made available to help create the capital stack for a creative broadband linked with community energy assets. So that's the wonderful challenge, the prosperity agenda at the local level that we have that could create 10 million jobs.
So Graham, thank you for that, and it's lovely to hear the passion for advanced energy, for green energy, and how you link that to broadband, which you know we will probably do another webcast on another time at that. But could you just speak a little bit directly, if you would mind, about why you are bullish, if you are bullish, if I'm wrong and I have this wrong, on opportunity zones, right? Because there are some who are critical, another Trump administration thing, and it'll just get changed when Trump's out of office. I've certainly heard that opinion, maybe even among some of our own panelists here. So I would definitely like to hear the case for opportunity zones as a means of advancing broadband deployments or broadband and clean energy deployments. Could you just speak to that for a few minutes, Graham?
Sure, and I won't get into a big debate about opportunity zones. It is part of the tax code. There was bipartisan support by Senator Cory Booker and Tim Scott, and I believe that it is a tool. It isn't the only tool, and I think if there's a new administration, I think that there should be some transparency, revisions, and improvements, but attracting private capital to 8,700 low-income communities is very important. And we can use that private capital to be leveraged with public resources to make the projects that did not pencil in low-income communities turn out to be financially viable. And infrastructure is one of the most, I think, important places to go. So to answer your question directly, if you're looking at just a typical project, give you an example of a project that is taking a brownfield, turning it into a solar field, and supplying the power locally to a low-income residential multifamily housing project. You're probably going to see a 30% additional internal rate of return from the different tax advantages that could come with the opportunity zone and other tax advantages. So
what was that number? What was that number again, Graham?
Well, it's a generalized number because every project is specific, but probably a 30% additional internal rate of return for that project. So what we're doing, Drew, is we're encouraging projects, dead malls, dinosaur buildings, brownfields, where you can put people to work with a clean energy project, typically solar plus storage. That's what we're looking at most frequently. But there are microgrids that are being developed in opportunity zones where the private sector dollars can be leveraged with public sector dollars. And so my top line belief is that the critical factor driving this is the local capacity and leadership to make opportunity zone projects work. I can cite small rural communities where in an opportunity zone in a community in Indiana with less than 20,000 residents, a project to bring housing. And I hope that'll be zero net energy, clean housing that has all the innovative features that include high-speed fiber optic connectivity. So this is not just an urban issue. Many of the 151 opportunity zones in Indiana are rural, and that's the case in California, where there are 800 opportunity zones, and many of them are in low-income rural areas. So the potential, Drew, to leverage the broadband funding through RDOF and other sources, that's the creativity at the local level that is most needed now. How do you take these silos of funding, public and private, and get them to work to make a project that benefits what we call the equitable clean economy, so that you get people who have a high energy burden, and by having a fully connected home and being able to put in rooftop solar and batteries and storage, Nest thermostats, all the technology which needs broadband to make it all work together, the digital infrastructure there, you can sometimes reduce the energy cost for a low-income renter by 80% on their utility bill or more. That's reducing the energy burden for a low-income person. And so opportunity zone funding makes more projects beneficial to hire more workers and to make sure that we have both the fully connected, but also the clean energy outcome, which is what is in demand. Locally produced clean energy is growing rapidly.
Thank you. That's awesome. And let's stick on the opportunity zone for just another few minutes before we kind of broaden it out. And we have a number of questions. It's not surprising, a lot are RDOF questions. And this one sort of, I'm going to put on the screen, kind of speaks to RDOF, but I think it's a broader question. Arthur Skinner asks, how can a city participate in RDOF funding for the entire muni sector when I heard Carol say it only supports underserved markets? So I guess just to be clear, obviously we're talking about two different things. Obviously, Rural Digital Opportunity Fund only supports particular areas. But could Carol, and Blair, I'd be particularly interested in your thoughts on the opportunity zone segments as it affects rural projects, right? So Carol, are you interacting with any projects that are considering going for RDOF funds that may also be eligible for opportunity zones? What are some of your thoughts on the RDOF, Carol? And I'll go ahead and unmute you so that you can speak to this.
Sure. I'm not aware of any of my clients going for opportunity zones. So simple answer is no.
So do you have any? Sorry, Graham, go ahead.
This is my question. It's my understanding of the roughly 2,500 municipal electric utilities. Many of them are in communities with less than 15, 20,000 population. So when I think of rural America, I think of not just open farmland, but I think of, in Indiana, rural electric cooperatives and small rural cities, towns that have a municipal electric utility. And so what we're seeing is, in some of those opportunity zones, you might be able to have a rural electric cooperative. Now, typically they have other sources of funding, or a municipality partner with a private investor who wants to use the tax advantages. And Blair, maybe you have some insight into that. I don't think this has been used widely, but I think it's possible.
Let me go ahead and make sure you're unmuted, Blair. Go ahead, Blair.
Great. I think it's possible. I think there's a problem of mapping. There's a big problem of mapping generally, which Carol can speak to better than I, in terms of the RDOF. And indeed, Congress, on a bipartisan basis, has told the FCC it needs to do a better job of mapping. And part of the problem is that the current way the FCC does it is if one home in a relevant area is connected, it considers the entire property connected, and that leads to a lot of inaccurate descriptions of what's connected or not connected. And so we have an interesting data problem of what areas are eligible. But the way the FCC defined eligibility for RDOF is very different than the way that opportunity zones were created, which was the state governments basically nominated areas saying that they could use opportunity zone funding. It was often very political. And by the way, I would just note, I think it's possible to be both critical and bullish about opportunity zones. Critical in the sense as the New York Times reported a year ago that a lot of the money going into it is for projects that would have been done anyway. They're often for high-end projects that are kind of, shall we say, on the outskirts of the so-called opportunity zones. But bullish in the sense that projects like the one you're talking about with clean energy or the broadband actually can make a big difference. And there was a very interesting economic study done about a year ago about the impact. And what it showed was, for the most part, opportunity zones have increased the tax value of the property that they improved, the specific building, but not the surrounding properties. So it's actually not having the economic impact it wanted. But if you think about, there's also a lot of studies that show when you add cleaner, cheaper energy to an area, or you add faster broadband to an area, it increases the property values of all the property, which is what you're really trying to do. So I do think opportunity zones, when it and broadband and energy projects are eligible, it could really accomplish what the drafters promised it would in that case. But right now, I think the overlap between the RDOF and the opportunity zones is probably limited, but I haven't studied the specifics.
Well, and I'm just going to mention one more critique that I've heard, which is that as it applies a broadband project, you're basically talking about everything needing to be within the opportunity zone, based again on my look at the rules. And so, you know, it may be better and more advantageous for certain types of investment, real estate, than for broadband. But again, I think Graham's
definitely more valuable for real estate. That's what it was designed to do, and that's part of the problem with it. Broadband is interesting, and I think the way to think about it is the capital gains tax benefits only exist to the extent that the broadband project is inside of the opportunity zone. But that's often not the map to have a viable system, where you're going to go outside that zone and serve surrounding areas, because you need that scale to make the project cash flow positive. But you only get the tax benefit for a subset of where you're building. So again, you have kind of a mapping issue where the tax benefit exists in a subsection of what is probably the viable or the rational economic map for a broadband project.
Well, Graham, unless you have any reactions on that, let's keep the conversation going. But I want to shift over to RDOF a little bit more. We're getting a number of questions here. One from Patricia Paoletta says, will RDOF cover fixed wireless access if providers can meet the service tiers, 25 megabits per second up, or just fiber? I can respond to that. I'll let Carol respond to it, though. First, go ahead, Carol. I'm going to unmute you first, okay? There we go.
That's an easy one. The answer is yes. The RDOF is open to any technology that can meet the particular performance requirements, and no question fixed wireless is capable of providing 25.3.
Well, and not just 25.3. There's obviously 4 tiers, 1
right.
gigabit down, 500 up, and the 25.3 is the lowest tier.
Right.
But the lower the speeds, the higher your weights. Would you mind explaining that to our listeners, Carol, how the weight?
It's complicated to explain. It's often better to do it with a chart, but the simple answer is there are 4 performance tiers, and there's a number associated with slower speed tiers or high latency service. And the way to think about that number is it's a discount. It's like the FCC. You know, just to use an example, the FCC will give a fiber provider $100 to do something. that's bidding in the gigabit tier, but if somebody's bidding in the 100 meg tier, they'll give them $80, and they'll give, a high latency 25.3 satellite provider, they'll only give them $10. So the weights serve to reduce the amount of actual money that goes to the entity that wins if they are slower speed or higher latency. And the real issue, as I said, there's no question that fixed wireless can, meet the 25.3 tier. There's plenty of fixed wireless providers out there. What has been the real battle in the FCC rulemaking is whether certain entities would be allowed to bid in the gigabit tier, and there the FCC decided categorically that satellite providers would not be allowed to bid for gigabit service, but it did say that fixed wireless entities would be allowed to apply to bid for gigabit service, and then they would have to demonstrate to the FCC staff that they are capable of providing gigabit.
Well, thank you for that great summary. I'd like to kind of get Blair into this about the tiers, right? We've had this anomaly where you referred to this, Blair, that some systems or some federal government programs have actually used lower tiers that are not officially broadband, right? Like the Reconnect program has a 10 megabits down, 1 megabit up
Right.
minimum requirement. They give more points if you have higher speeds, but that's the minimum. And Blair, I'm just wondering, do we need to upgrade all of these? Should we really be doing gig up, gig down as the one and only tier, or what's your take on this multiple tiers that we have and how that kind of comports with your experience looking backwards from the National Broadband Plan for how we want to be getting towards higher speeds? Go ahead, Blair.
So I'm going to give you an answer that people in Washington really give. The answer is I don't know. And I really wish that the Federal Communications Commission had worked with the carriers and others, particularly during COVID, to reevaluate the question of what should be the minimum tier or what should be the minimum requirement. It seems to me that in light of all the different uses that we're now seeing, including, for example, what we're doing right now, it would be a very good thing to have an updated technical assessment of what we want everyone to have in their homes. If you are someone who has 3 kids attending school online, you may need something different. So I don't know what the answer is. I suspect it's more symmetric, and I suspect it's higher than the 25.3, which is to say both numbers should be higher. But I don't know the answer to that. It could be that actually people are doing great with 10.10. I doubt it, but what we have seen is in the marketplace is an acceleration of cable taking share from DSL providers, which suggests to me a market. The market is telling us that the consumers think we need more, and that should inform the FCC's view. Minimum definition is. But I wish the FCC, instead of just trying to figure out what their gut is, would actually, take advantage of this 90-day experiment, study the problem, and give us an updated answer. Certainly the answer that we had 10 years ago is not the answer. Not because we didn't do our work, but because things have changed since then.
And what was your answer 10 years ago? Was it 25.3 or was it higher or lower?
No, it was 10. Wasn't it 10.1, Carol? Maybe even been 4.1.
4.1.
It was 4.1.
It was 4.1.
And by the way, that was a 500% increase over the 750 that the FCC had done earlier. Right. It looks phenomenally low in retrospect. I can kind of defend it, but the truth is, part of the reason, the only reason I can really defend it is because we were under the working assumption that all the money to support networks had to come from the Universal Service Fund instead of the kind of one-time capital appropriation that the House Democrats are now offering, that the Trump administration may offer, and which is a much better way to do it. And in order to make the numbers work, 4:1 was about as good as you could get. And again, at that time, you didn't have as much streaming video, and there were a lot of other things. You certainly didn't have people routinely doing this. You didn't have, people doing the remote work that they're now doing. But having said that, the point is the number needs to be a lot bigger, but it should be based on an actual technical assessment.
Well, it needs to be continually improving, and it hasn't improved in many years, five or more years.
Well, I kind of agree with that. I would just note that, if you had projected the speed of cars in 1900 and 1920, we would be, probably we should be going about 5,000 miles an hour in a car or something like that. In other words, given the dirt roads and given the nature of the cars, we were going from 5 miles an hour to about what we are today by the early 20s. It could be that human capacity is limited for our ability to discern the quality of the picture. But I actually don't think that's the best analysis. I think the better analysis is we will constantly come up with new applications that require more and more bandwidth.
We've got a new question here that's just teed up for you, Carol. If a network supports multiple speed tiers, how are the funding weights calculated? Could you address that?
Sure. The simple answer is I should take a step back and explain how the auction works. The minimum geographic unit you can bid on is a census block group. And whatever you bid for that unit, it can only be in one of the 4 tiers that we've talked about. You're welcome to bid on multiple census block groups, and in the first block, you say, I'm going to do 25.3, and in the next block, I'm going to do gig. You can do that if you're bidding on them individually. So, over a larger geographic footprint, you can use one technology. You can run fiber all the way to the home and bid gigabit service, but then in the more challenging geographic areas, you can use fixed wireless and, bid a different tier for that. So, bidders have a lot of flexibility. Now, if they choose to package all their bids together into what's called a package bid, then you have to pick one tier.
Good. I'm going to pull up one more question too, and let's let Carol start with this one, but others may comment. Does RDOF require performance tests and reporting?
Yes, there are significant reporting requirements and compliance requirements that anybody that's looking into this program should be aware of. In particular, entities are required to do both performance speed testing and latency testing and report those results on a quarterly basis and their financial consequences. If you don't, if you bid in a particular tier and you're authorized to provide a particular kind of service, if you fail to actually deliver what you've promised to the FCC, then there are consequences.
Here's another question. Maybe Graham or Blair or Carol could speak to. Andrew Davis asks, Opportunity Appalachia is working to attract Opportunity Zone investments in West Virginia. One is a fiber network and data center. Can very rural municipalities work together for a critical mass of demand? Graham, would you like to take that one first?
Well, I appreciate the question from Andrew because it goes to the heart of what we hope will happen. If there's a massive additional stimulus package, we don't know how that will play out, but there's already, as we mentioned before, trillions of dollars available. So I think the challenge is this. It's pulling together within in Appalachia, not as familiar as that as I am with my home state of Indiana, but when you pull together individuals and companies within a given area, and Drew, you know this from your work with the Southern Illinois Broadband Initiative when you were leading that effort in Illinois. And if you get together the rural electric cooperative, the opportunity to work with the provider that might be there and the municipalities that are small but in a given area in Appalachia, it's convening and connecting and building a collaboration model. And yes, we know that there are, going back to the opportunity zones, Opportunity Alabama, the Regional Appalachia Commission, and in other parts of the country, like in Maine, you have Arcturus, participating to bring rural development, which includes broadband and includes locally produced electricity. And so the issue is one of getting those people who have leadership in the community to come together and say, we want the broadband infrastructure, highest and best possible. I favor, gig fiber, but whatever you can work to get together. And then it's a process of community-based economic development. And I hope in post-COVID, we have more collaborations where people who didn't normally 20, 30 years ago get in the same room. The rural telco with the rural electric cooperative. We saw in Indiana and in other states mergers of those smaller entities together. Well, now the rural electric cooperative needs to produce its own power locally because the big coal-fired power plant or other assets that were a long way away that produced power and they bought into it. That's a changing transition to locally owned and operated. And so in every region, in every community area, getting people together to talk about how they can build a partnership. And that's where we have to get out of the silos. We have to get into systems thinking. And so, yes, it is possible to do what the questioner pulled together. And there are pockets of money that you can go after for the same project, from the EDA at the federal level, from the Rural Development Administration, from the RUS, from the Department of Energy. There's different pots of money that you can then use for a collaborative local project.
Now, we've got about 9 minutes left, and I want to make sure we touch on and come back to this issue. I heard a lot from Graham in this earlier about the public-private partnership. When we have our August 10th event, Digital Infrastructure Investment, the physical virtual event, we're going to be talking at length about new financial models for last mile and other data center and tower aspects of infrastructure. And I'm just wondering if Graham or Blair or Carol could speak to how any of these tools, federal funds, RDOF funds, or others, can help unpack that and facilitate. Maybe there's a greater public component to the infrastructure, but there's still a private sector involvement. Blair, I don't know. Have you thought much about this question of municipal ownership of a piece of the chain, but not the entire chain?
I think we've seen over the last decade so many different models. For example, Huntsville, Alabama had its public electric provider build out fiber, which had then leased to Google, so that there was, some public ownership of some facility, but there was a lot of private. You've seen this in rural Maryland. Similar kinds of projects where the government is doing certain things, but not other things. There's a lot of different things, right? There's control of the physical asset, the rights of way. There's certain kinds of other physical assets, buildings, which governments generally control. So you can lease those out. But there's so many different pieces. I don't think there's one size fits all. I think you have to look at, what are you trying to accomplish? What's your need? The city of New York earlier this year put out a broadband plan that asked for a lot of private cooperation. There are networks everywhere in New York, but there are a lot of places where the networks are inadequate, and they wanted input from the private sector about what city assets they could make available that could help solve those problems. So I think it's very, very specific. And if you have a public electric utility, you have a very different situation than if you don't. If you have a college that's dominant in your area, you have a very different situation. You just have to break down all the different elements and then figure out the best way of doing it in that area.
It's really going to vary, is what I'm hearing. I wonder, sure. Carol, if you have any thoughts on this question and also the one of how, part of what we're trying to talk about is getting the return on investment to a reasonable point, right? Again, this was talked about a little bit earlier. In some of these rural and maybe also very urban areas, the economics don't pencil in any other way. What are some of your thoughts about both the public-private partnership, but also the return on investment angle, Carol?
Well, I think, the FCC's program, the RDOF and its predecessor, the Connect America Fund, it by and large has been, funding, private sector entities, but it also, as has been noted, has funded cooperatives, and in some instances actually has funded municipalities in the past. So there's no prohibition from the FCC perspective. There is a legal requirement, which is statutory under federal law, that any entity that receives the money has to be what's called an eligible telecommunications carrier. And there are some state laws that prevent certain kinds of entities from, getting into the broadband business or the voice business. But from the FCC's perspective, it's open to the notion of, entities pulling together different sources of funding. Indeed, as part of the application process, if you bid in the RDOF and you win, you then file an in-depth application. And one of the things the FCC asks you is, what is your source of funding to fund your project costs for the first 2 years that are in excess of the amount of money you're getting from this fund? So, the FCC recognizes people need to get funding from other sources, and entities can and should be exploring these different opportunities, once they're a winning bidder, layering on different sources of funding. And that's what makes the economics of something work, or it can make it better. It can make it possible for a company to complete the construction more quickly than it otherwise would, and accelerate, by accelerating construction, then you can actually start, picking up subscriber revenues as well, which also improves the business case. So.
Well, that is very, very useful and very helpful information. We're getting towards our top of the hour mark with 3 minutes to go. I'm wondering if I could give each of you an opportunity to offer some final thoughts on this broader topic. Let's go in reverse order, Graham, and then Blair and Carol, on again, the biggest picture here. How can federal funds be used either through RDOF or through other programs to change the economics for hard to reach areas?
I go back to my chart. What we need most is the local leadership to put the projects together that bring a systems solution at the community level. And we're now seeing a transformation both in the need and the demand for locally produced clean energy and locally viable high capacity broadband. It's not, there's no question, but what each of these are critical infrastructure, advanced economy infrastructure. And so that gets done at the local level. And it's pulling together people who don't typically talk to each other, get in the same virtual room under COVID, and begin to have multiple discussions about what are your assets? How could they work? Specific example, back in 2000, when I was the mayor of Fort Wayne, we put together a consortium. We ended up getting all the colleges, universities, aggregating our buying power, went out and put out an RFP to create an educational network connecting over 55,000 elementary and secondary school students, then all the colleges and the universities. That has been done in many, many communities across the country. We can now add the clean energy piece to that because of this revolution in both locally needed broadband of high speed and local clean energy.
Very good. Thank you so much. Blair, I'll unmute you and give you an opportunity to speak to this issue and what we should be looking for down the line on this.
I would simply say stay tuned. I think, we've made a lot of progress in the last 10 years, but I think we've hit a real pivot point in terms of what we might think of as the remote economy, where questions of digital inclusion and equity are moving to the forefront. And the country has to develop better solutions than we have today. And so whether it be in an infrastructure bill, a recovery act, or some other changes at the FCC. I think there are opportunities there, but the opportunities are going to, there's a certain kind of window where they're going to close, but I would look to the next couple of years to see a lot of new opportunities. And thank you.
Thank you. Carol, and any final words that you'd like to share with us on RDOF or the broader topic we've been discussing?
Well, for RDOF in particular, but also more broadly, you don't get broadband if you don't have a willing provider. Money is available, but if no one, in the RDOF, if no one wants to bid for an area, it's not going to get money and it's not going to get served. And what that means is every community across the nation that is unserved today, they need to ask themselves, what can we do to get some entity, whether it's a private sector entity, a public-private sector partnership, or whatever, whatever the model is, like, what do we need to do to get somebody interested in serving the area? There's a lot of different programs. Honestly, it can be mind-boggling, all the different programs and all the different requirements. There's no one way to get it done, but at the end of the day, the areas that are unserved need to actually actively think about, what are we going to do to change the paradigm, get my area, my community served.
Well, thank you very much. And maybe to paraphrase another politician, all broadband is local. I mean, that's one message we've definitely heard, that there's going to be different issues in each community, rural or urban. And I want to invite our listeners not only to register for digital infrastructure investment on August 10th, when we'll be talking about all of these issues, but also next week on June 24th, we'll be discussing the neutral host infrastructure, discussing how cell towers, which were once proprietary, before carriers partnered with infrastructure owners, and that host infrastructure model, will that take to 5G and to small cells. Thanks for being with us. Thank you to our guests, Carol Maddie, Blair Levin, Graham Richard, and we'll see you next week. Take care.